Hey there, art nerds. I'm Becca, and today I'm going to show you 3 different watercolor bookmarks, all using the same basic technique. This is part of my Stashbuster series, so if you've got a hoard of watercolor paper that you've been sitting on, this could be a great tutorial to get you actually using those art supplies you've spent so much money on. I've got some other great Stashbuster tutorials that I hope you guys will check out. Be sure to check the cards in the description because I will be linking a few of my favorites for you guys just to make it handy. So grab your paints and grab your paper and let's get started. I'm going to start out with the most basic of the bookmarks, and all of these kind of work on a glazing technique. So glazing is pretty straightforward. You put down a thin layer of watercolor, allow it to dry, and then apply another thin layer of watercolor. So for this, we are using my favorite watercolors, my Daily Driver watercolor palette, but I encourage you to use your favorite watercolors. So we are starting out with a scrap of watercolor paper. I recommend you use cotton rag watercolor paper for the techniques we're going to demonstrate today. I'm also using MT washi tape to tape my watercolor paper down to a structural support. I'm using gatorboard. That's the same stuff that they make political signs out of. It's a great way to recycle. You can also use chipboard, basically anything that's going to give your watercolor paper some structure. I've also got a spray bottle of water. I'm going to go ahead and pre-activate my watercolor paints. These are just some of my favorite watercolors over the years, and I'm trying to go for some really bright saturated colors here. So I encourage you to use some of your favorite watercolors, and if you don't know what watercolors to start with, I've got some great reviews both for student grade and professional grade watercolors that should hopefully help you guys get going. I'm using a large quill here, but what really matters is using a larger soft watercolor brush. You can use synthetic, that is totally fine. And I am applying my first layer, a fairly thin wash of yellow. You can start with whatever color selection you want to, but I really recommend you start out with your lightest colors and build up to your darker colors. So not shown, I allowed that first layer to dry completely, utterly, and fully, and I'm starting in with my next color. So what's really cool about glazing is this is a great opportunity to see some color theory in play, because by layering our colors this way, we're building up new colors. So this can be a great way to really explore and play around with your watercolors to get to know them a little bit better in a way that doesn't really require a lot of confidence. You don't have to be particularly good at watercolor to be able to do this bookmark. That's the whole point of the Stashbuster series, is if you've been hoarding your watercolor supplies, this should help you bust that stash. So the trick for glazing here is to just allow each layer to dry totally, and sometimes that can take a while, especially if you live in a humid area like I do. I live in Southeast Louisiana, and we're not just glazing a bunch of similar colors. I want to kind of run the color gamut here. So we have a yellow, we have an orange, we have a hot pink. Next we have an ultramarine blue, and the trick is to really observe the colors that we're creating, the new mixes that we're generating, just by glazing our colors one on top of the other and having a little bit of patience. And even though this is a very simple technique, although patience is hard for some of us, you end up with a cute watercolor bookmark that really exemplifies some of the best traits of watercolor. So next I'm going in with a cooler blue, but like I said earlier, you can use whatever colors make your heart sing, whatever colors you like. If you want it to be monochromatic, you can go for that. If you want it to be a sunset, you can go for that. But I wanted to kind of depict a rainbow here so that we could really explore how different colors affect one another, especially as we build up those glazes, as we build up those layers. So next I'm going in with a hooker's green, and while I don't really think the colors are super important, I'll try to list them out for you guys down in the description below in case you want to paint along. So I allow that to dry completely, and then we're going in with a dioxine violet, which at this stage is pretty much going to look like a really rich saturated black since we've built up all these layers. And then for my final layer, I'm going in with lamp black. So there's a lot of variations that you can use on this to make it more interesting, more fun. Hopefully now you guys have the basic technique for this. I'm going to show you 2 other variations. One of them is super simple and the other one is a little bit more complicated. So we're going to allow this to dry completely, totally, and fully before removing our masking fluid. And there we have the first of our 3 bookmarks that I'm going to demonstrate in today's tutorial. So the technique we really focused on for this one, glazing, just very easy. Some top tips for your best success though would be to work with a softer watercolor brush for this rather than a stiffer one. So if you have a softer synthetic like a mop or a really soft flat, that might work really well. I really recommend the silver black velvet watercolor brushes for this kind of thing because they're so soft. Squirrel brushes would also be excellent for this because you don't want to disrupt your prior layers. You also, as you add each additional layer, you don't really want to fuss around with it too much. That's why I did a very simple line across the bottom to kind of designate where our layer ends. And then I just kind of quickly went into it with another wash of watercolor. If you scrub it too much, you're going to disrupt the prior layers. So for our next tutorial, very much the same principle, but this time we're introducing masking fluid. Now, you could do whatever shapes you want for this. Stars would be cute, moons would be cute, hearts would be cute. I'm doing kind of a sparkle effect, harkening back to my shoujo inspiration roots since I am a watercolor comic artist. That's my main thing. But what we're going to be doing here is pretty much the same. Now, if you want to, I would recommend going in with a pencil, maybe a non-photo blue pencil or some pink lead or a coal erase, just something, and sketching in your shapes so that you can kind of plan how they're going to change and plan how you want to mask them out as we figure out our color gradations. I actually made a little map here to figure out kind of how I wanted to handle the sparkles. And I'll go ahead and spoil this. I messed up a little bit with how I did this because I did it over a couple of days. It just took a really long time for it to dry because adding in the masking fluid is a whole nother element of waiting for everything to dry. But if you plan it carefully and you have a nice, lazy, not too humid afternoon, then you can do this no problem. It's not actually difficult. I just confused myself. So pretty much the same principles apply for the basics. We're really relying on glazing. We're not doing any really difficult or challenging techniques for this. But in between our glazes, we're going to use some masking fluid to start masking in our shapes. And what I wanted for this is I wanted my shapes to also kind of shift color through the glazes. So what I'm doing is I'm basically masking off half or a part of the shape. This is where the pencil might be handy, or making a map of how you want your color changes to happen would also be handy, because I'm going to mask off, let's say, half of the sparkle here in the yellow, and then after I do my next layer, which is going to be an orangish layer, I'm going to mask off the other half. And this is going to become a lot easier to understand as you actually see me demonstrate it. So some tips for working with masking fluid. I'm working with Winsor & Newton's removable. The removable part is important. Yellow colored masking fluid. That way it shows up kind of yellowish on a white paper so you can see what you've done if you're working from a white paper. I am working with a synthetic stiff bristled watercolor brush, and I've already scrubbed in some brush soap, and this prevents the brush from soaking up that latex into the metal ferrule and basically ruining your brush. Now, not shown, as soon as I'm done applying my masking fluid, I went and I scrubbed the masking fluid out of the brush, kind of pulling it out of the bristles so it doesn't get in there and ruin the brush. But I would recommend you not use a watercolor brush that you're particularly attached to when you're working with masking fluid, because there's always a chance that the masking fluid can ruin your watercolor brushes. I allow my masking fluid to dry completely before I start applying my layers of watercolor. So the way this technique works is we apply our masking fluid, let it dry, apply our layer of watercolor, let it dry, and then apply another layer of masking fluid, just kind of working back and forth. And that's one of the reasons this one takes longer than some of the other ones, is just all that dry time. If you live in a humid area, it can make your dry time take longer. Now, I know some of you guys are yelling at me, pull out a hair dryer. So the thing about a hair dryer is I have found when I use the hairdryer, even on the cool setting, on masking fluid, it makes it permanently adhere to my watercolor paper, which is not good. You don't want that. So for me, you could turn on your air conditioning. You could turn on a fan. That air circulation would really help. You could turn on a dehumidifier. Those are all options. Or you could just be patient and maybe juggle another task while you're working on this. It kind of depends on what your workflow looks like. So I think you guys have the basic gist for what I'm doing here. I wanted to leave some shapes hollow and some shapes filled in, but it really kind of boils down to what you want to do and what you feel like doing. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit since I know you guys have got the point now, and that way you guys can kind of see how it comes together. So for this bookmark, I aimed for a warmer color palette than what we started with our other one. The other one was kind of a exploration, a demonstration, a celebration of what glazing can do and what kind of colors you can expect from glazing, especially with multiple glazes. But with this one, I wanted kind of a really warm sunset sort of appearance. So I'm being a lot more gradual with my color shifts. We're staying in the yellows, oranges, and pinks for a lot longer. And I'm going to use up more of the bookmark with our color rather than just kind of fading to black as quickly. Much like Icarus, I flew too close to the sun. I wanted to do some color shifts across multiple colors, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I was having such long dry times, and I was in and out of the house and doing other chores that I kind of lost track of myself. So if you're a bit forgetful like me, if you know you have ADHD, it might be better to either go in with a pencil, and that way you're way less likely to forget where your color shifts are supposed to be and when you're supposed to be applying your masking fluid. See, I goofed it up there. So if you mess up, it's not really a big deal. These are for fun. I'm just pointing it out in case I can help you guys avoid the mistakes. I'm still happy with how the bookmark turned out. I'm still going to use it, but if you're a perfectionist and that's going to bother you, then going in with a pencil and sketching it in first, while it'll be noticeable on those earlier colors, it's not going to be as noticeable probably as if you made the mistake and you skipped a layer. And when we remove the masking fluid at the end, as we're doing now, so I allowed everything to dry, now I'm removing the masking fluid, that's really going to be when you kind of notice those mistakes. But another thing you could do that is far lower risk, way less chance of a mistake, is just doing spackles or speckles or like splatters with your masking fluid and just adding more for every layer. And if that is confusing, let me know down in the comments below. I'd be more than happy to demonstrate it for you guys, but I feel like you guys probably kind of get the point. This is a really easy one though. So then I'm going in with some white gouache. So kind of like with the lens flare tutorial that I did for you guys. And I'm just using it to clean up some of the outlines because masking fluid, I don't always get the cleanest outlines, and this allows me to kind of hide some of the mistakes. I love white gouache for this, okay? So in my watercolor comics, I'm always using white gouache or buff colored gouache or watercolor pencils to just kind of tweak things a little bit, to clarify some details or to cover some areas or to adjust the color. Because one thing people get wrong about watercolor, I think, is they think that once you've made a mistake, you're stuck with it, which is absolutely not the case. I mean, no, it's not quite like oils or acrylics where you can kind of paint over it, but there are a lot of ways that you can work over your mistakes to make sure that they're not as noticeable. And using white gouache can be a great way to kind of remedy some of those mistakes. If you end up following along with this tutorial, or you decide to go a completely different route, but you were inspired by some of the techniques that I showed you guys here, I would love to check out your work. You can tag me at Nattosoup, Nattosoup, on pretty much every social media platform, because I would love to see what kind of art you make. So once it's had a chance to fully dry, we're going to remove our masking tape pulling away at a 90-degree angle. And there we have the second of our 3 bookmarks. And the only thing you really needed to add for this one is some masking fluid, a stiff bristled synthetic brush, some brush soap, and you can actually use baby shampoo or bar soap if you don't have brush soap. And I like to use a masking fluid pickup just because I have really dry hands and I can't quite get the masking fluid to come up when I try to peel it off by hand. And you can find those practically anywhere. Even Dollar Tree carries them in the crafters corner. So hopefully this wasn't too difficult and you have all the materials that you need. So now we're going to get a little bit tricky with it. I'm going to show you guys how to paint a sunset, but don't worry, this is not difficult. If you've mastered the techniques that I showed you in the other 2 tutorials, you definitely got this. Now, one thing I would recommend, if you have a longer scrap of watercolor paper in your stash, go for that, because that's going to give you more room for the sunset and the reflection on the water. But we're working with basically the same materials that we've been working with. I like to keep it simple here in our Stashbuster tutorials. But one of the important things is we're going to start out by taping down our watercolor scrap. That's going to give us a nice clean border. So I talk about how much I like MT washi tape. And I have used a lot of cheap washi tapes in the past. I've used blue masking tape in the past. The MT washi tape gives me a really clean outline and it doesn't seep under it all that often. It's pretty rare for the watercolor to seep under it, which with cheaper tapes is not the case. So I am starting out with my masking fluid. I am doing a splatter technique, kind of like what I was talking about in the last tutorial, to create the illusion of stars at the top of our bookmark. Once that's had a chance to totally and completely dry, we're going to start in with our glazes, but we're going to do a cheat for a graduated wash. So I apply my yellow, I'm opening up my masking fluid again, I'm going to splatter in, I'm going to paint in my sun for our sunset, sorry. And I'm just doing a circle for that, really pretty simple, very close to the horizon line, but not quite on it since it's a sunset, but the sun hasn't set completely yet. And then I splatter in some additional stars. I allow that to dry completely, and then I select my next color, which is going to be kind of a hot pink since we're painting a sunset. I'm going to handle this almost the same way I handle the glazes in the past, but I'm going to use some clean water and I'm going to bring that down, as you guys can see, allowing it to kind of intermix. And then I'm going to add a little bit more of our saturated color at the top because it wasn't quite as dark as I would have liked it to be. I'm going to let that dry fully, and I'm going to do the same thing with my future layers. Now, to encourage gravity to help me out here to do some of the work for me, I propped it up just a couple of inches, and that way the paint's going to be encouraged to run down as we add our water. So much like with our other 2 tutorials, I allow the prior layers to dry, and then I use some clean water to kind of soften that transition layer to layer. I don't care if it's like a perfectly soft blend. A little bit of blooming actually looks very pretty here. It kind of looks like clouds. So while you don't want to add too much clean water to it, so I recommend having a paper towel handy just to tap off some of that excess water so that you're not adding so much water to the paper. A little bit of excess water is fine and it's not really going to be noticeable. So one of the color combos I discovered that I absolutely love is a neon pink with some ultramarine blue on top of it. And it really creates this beautiful kind of hot purple color. And the granulation in the ultramarine blue is just so pretty on top of the staining effects of your hot pink or your opera rose, depending on what you have handy and what you feel like using. It just creates this really pretty purple color. And then I'm going to add in some darker purple. I believe that is our dioxine purple, but if you would prefer to use rose of ultramarine or ultramarine violet, something more granulating, go for it. And since it wasn't quite dark enough for me, I wasn't getting quite the contrast I wanted, I went in with a more saturated version of it just at the top, allowing gravity to pull some of that color down for me. So now that I've added some black to the top, I'm going to remove my masking fluid or masking tape. You guys can see I got a nice clean line from it. I'm going to apply it, and I should have pressed harder here because I did get some water seepage later on, but we'll talk about that more a little bit later. And then using a flat brush with some yellow, I'm going to start to paint kind of the reflection of the sun on the water. And I'm just using really short, kind of jagged brush strokes and kind of making it larger, like fading it out as we get to the bottom. And then using ultramarine blue while it's still wet, I'm going to use the same flat brush cleaned out just to kind of feather in some ultramarine blue. Now, if you work with a smaller brush, you can better control how much water you've got going on and how much yellow you've got going on. But this is a simple tutorial, super easy, so I'm not really concerned about it. I'm here to have fun, not stress out. So I'm going back in with the same flat. I dabbed in some more yellow. I allowed it to dry. I removed my masking tape, and oh look, it bled underneath. What am I gonna do? I decided to turn that into tree shapes, kind of like we're looking at a distant shore. It's not quite as pretty as sunset over just water, but we're here to make it work. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of ways to kind of salvage watercolor. Sometimes you got to change your plan a little bit. So I started out with ultramarine blue, and then while it was still wet, I dabbed in some Hooker's green. The specific colors don't really matter. Just kind of go with what you've got and what you like, and I'm sure you will make it work. While that's drying, I'm going in with some indigo blue down at the bottom just to kind of create the illusion that the water is getting darker the further it is from the sunset. You can choose to do this, you can choose not to do this. I'm working while it's still wet. That kind of fades things out. If you let it dry, it's going to give you a sharper transition. It kind of just depends on what you like and what you think looks good. And then into the tree line, I'm adding in, you can use black, you can use Payne's Gray, you can use indigo, just kind of darken it up so it's more of a silhouette of trees rather than trees. And you guys can see why we taped this down, because if you look really carefully, you can see how the paper has started to bow. That's why we've taped it down so it doesn't curl on us. And while it's still kind of damp, I'm dabbing in some more of my yellow. I'm working with a more opaque yellow that's going to stand out against the blue a little bit more. If you wanted to, you could use masking fluid and mask that out and then remove it at the end. If you want kind of that crisper sort of sunset look, it's just what you want, what you feel like. Then once things have had a chance to dry, I'm going to use a masking fluid pickup. Not mandatory, but I find them really helpful to kind of remove our masking fluid, to clean up our stars, to remove the masking fluid from the sun. And this isn't really a difficult thing. The masking fluid wants to stick to the pickup, so it's actually pretty easy. I would recommend don't drag it like you're erasing, just kind of lightly touch it to the page and allow the masking fluid to stick to your masking fluid pickup. And then once it's dried, we can remove our masking tape, again, pulling away at a 90-degree angle. And now we have a completed watercolor sunset bookmark. And I bet that was way easier than you thought it would be. We're using masking fluid for a lot of the hard part and a little bit of patience for the rest of it. So this is a really easy way to get some really satisfying effects. And the more you play with your watercolors, the more you're going to learn what they're capable of doing for you, and the more ideas you're going to have for art pieces you can create. Now, I have some more in-depth watercolor tutorials if you're looking for that. I am a watercolor comic artist and illustrator, and I share what I know here on YouTube. So if you enjoyed this tutorial, not only do I have more great Stashbuster tutorials that have already been released and are coming out in the future for you guys to look forward to, but I've also got art supply reviews and just general watercolor illustration and walkthroughs that I share here on a regular basis. So I would love it if you considered subscribing, clicking that bell notification, and sticking around, hanging out with me, because I update twice a week and I think I've always got something fun or interesting to share with you guys. If you're looking for some sneak peeks at what I'm going to be working on or what I'm currently working on, a great way to find out about that is by joining me over on TikTok at Nattosoup, Nattosoup, or you can check out my shorts section here on YouTube. But hopefully these 3 tutorials taught taught you something today, maybe even just an appreciation for the underloved glazing technique, the oft ignored hero of many a watercolor illustration. It's certainly my most used technique. It's a really simple one to master. It's a good workhorse, and it's definitely one that you should be familiar with. And all it really requires is some patience, which is amazing. You don't need specialty anything. You don't need special techniques. You don't need to be particularly good at painting. You just need some patience, which, while I feel like it's in short supply for me, maybe you've got plenty of it. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. A huge thank you to my amazing patrons on Patreon. They make tutorials like this possible. If you want to help support what I'm doing, you can join me over at patreon.com/natosoup.